In the quiet, suburban landscape of Maryland during the late 1949, the world seemed to be settling into a predictable and peaceful rhythm. The heavy shadows of the Great War were finally receding, and for most families, life was defined by the simple, comforting traditions of home, school, and community. Among these unassuming households lived a young boy whose real name would eventually be shielded behind the pseudonym Roland Doe. At 13 years old, Roland was the image of an ordinary American teenager of his era. He was known to be somewhat shy and introverted, possessing a reserved nature that kept him close to the safety of his family circle. He spent his days navigating the halls of his local school and his evenings basking in the familiar warmth of his living room, entirely unaware that the thin, fragile veil between the world of the living and the world of the unknown was about to be torn violently apart. Roland shared a particularly deep and unique bond with his Aunt Harriet. She was a woman of curious interests and a gentle soul, but she was also deeply fascinated by the world of spiritualism and the possibility of communicating with those who had passed on to the other side. To Roland, Harriet was not an eccentric relative to be feared, but rather a source of wonder and wisdom who treated him with a kindness that felt like a sanctuary. It was Aunt Harriet who first introduced the young boy to the Ouija board, presenting it to him as little more than a harmless hobby or a simple game that could bridge the gap between two realms. Together, they would sit for hours in the dim light, their fingers resting lightly on the wooden planchette as it glided across the letters and numbers. For Roland, these sessions were a way to feel special, a secret shared with his favorite aunt that made the world feel larger and more mysterious. However, in the quiet corners of that Maryland winter, this innocent curiosity was planting the seeds of a nightmare that would soon consume his life. The stability of Roland's world crumbled when Aunt Harriet passed away suddenly, leaving the family in a state of profound shock. The loss was devastating for the 13-year-old boy, leaving a cold void in his heart that no amount of comfort from his parents could seem to fill. In his deep grief and desperation, Roland turned to the one thing that he felt still connected him to her spirit. He pulled out the Ouija board. Sitting alone in his room, desperate for one last conversation or even a small sign that she was still there, watching over him from the beyond. At first, there was nothing but the heavy, oppressive silence of his bedroom. But soon, the atmosphere in the house began to shift in subtle and unsettling ways. It started with sounds that defied any logical explanation. In the dead of night, the family would hear the rhythmic, persistent sound of water dripping in the kitchen. Yet every faucet in the house was found to be tightly shut, and every pipe was bone dry. Then came the scratching. It was a dry, frantic sound, like fingernails dragging behind the heavy wallpaper or deep within the floorboards, moving from room to room with a chilling speed. The disturbances escalated with a terrifying momentum that left the family paralyzed with fear. What had begun as inexplicable noises soon manifested as physical violations of the household's peace. Roland would lie in his bed at night, trying to find the solace of sleep, only to feel the entire heavy frame of his bed begin to vibrate. At first, it was a subtle tremor, but within days, the bed would shake with such incredible violence that the boy would be thrown onto the hard floor. Objects in the house began to take on a malicious life of their own. A heavy wooden rocking chair would swing back and forth with great force in an empty room. Vases and plates would slide across polished tables as if pushed by an invisible angry hand. The parents, terrified and deeply confused, could find no rational reason for the chaos unfolding within their walls. Their son, once a quiet and peaceful child, was now the center of a supernatural storm that he could neither understand nor control. But the most horrifying manifestations were not the objects moving in the room, but what began to appear directly on Roland's own body. Red, angry welts started to erupt across his chest, his arms, and his thighs. These were not mere rashes or allergic reactions. They were deep, painful scratches that seemed to be carved into his flesh from the inside out by an unseen force. To the horror of his mother and father, these marks began to form recognizable patterns and symbols. Words would rise in the flesh, weeping and bright red, as if the boy's skin had become a living parchment for a cruel and invisible scribe. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The physical pain Roland endured was immense, and the psychological toll on the 13-year-old was becoming unbearable. Desperate for any kind of solution, the family sought the help of the most learned men they could find. They visited esteemed doctors and experienced psychologists, hoping for a medical diagnosis that could explain the shaking furniture and the spontaneous markings on their son's skin. But science offered no sanctuary and no answers. The medical doctors found Roland to be physically healthy, and the psychologists could find no evidence of a known mental disorder that could account for the external physical phenomena occurring around him. The experts were utterly baffled, and their lack of answers only served to deepen the family's sense of dread. They were witnessing something that simply did not fit into the neat, logical boxes of modern medicine. As the manifestations grew more aggressive and the boy's personality began to flicker and fade, a chilling realization finally began to settle over the household. The entity that had responded to Roland's calls on the Ouija board was never his beloved Aunt Harriet. It was something far older and much more malevolent, a presence that had been lurking in the darkness, waiting for any invitation to enter the world of the living. The boy had inadvertently opened a door he could not close, and whatever had come through was now claiming him piece by piece, body and soul. The realization, cold and stark as a winter morning, that an ancient malevolence had found its way into their home through the innocent curiosity of a grieving boy propelled Roland Doe's family into a desperate flight. They packed their meager belongings and, with heavy hearts, left behind the haunted walls of their Maryland residence, seeking refuge and an explanation in the bustling city of St. Louis, Missouri. Hope was a fragile thing, a flickering candle in the encroaching darkness, that a change of scenery, a new environment, might somehow sever the insidious connection. They prayed that the entity, whatever it was, might be bound to the house, to the Ouija board, to the very air of their former lives. Their prayers, however, went unanswered. The malevolent presence, now emboldened and seemingly fueled by their fear, followed them, its grip on Roland Doe tightening with an even greater, terrifying malice. The disturbances did not cease. They intensified, escalating into a symphony of unseen terror that left no doubt the fight had merely moved locations. In their utter despair, with science and reason having offered no solace, the family turned to the church, their last bastion of hope. They reached out to their local parish, and soon 2 men of God were drawn into the burgeoning nightmare, Father William Bowdern and Father Raymond Bishop. These were men of faith, their lives dedicated to the spiritual, yet they were largely unequipped for the visceral, chilling reality that awaited them. Their training had prepared them for spiritual warfare within the confines of theological texts and solemn rites, not for the raw, terrifying spectacle of a young boy ensnared by an undeniable evil. They approached Roland Doe with a mixture of apprehension and unwavering resolve, knowing that they were venturing into a realm where the boundaries of the natural and supernatural blurred into a horrifying tapestry. The first ritual, an attempt to reclaim Roland Doe's soul, commenced in an atmosphere thick with dread and the acrid smell of fear. The room, consecrated with holy water, felt charged, as if 2 opposing forces were already clashing within its very air. As the priests began their prayers, Roland Doe, the shy, introverted boy, underwent a horrifying transformation. His body, once frail and trembling, seemed to swell with an unseen power. His eyes, usually filled with terror, now burned with an ancient, mocking light. From his throat, no longer issuing the frightened whimpers of a child, erupted a series of guttural voices, speaking in languages no one present could understand. These were not mere imitations. They were deep, resonant, and filled with an ancient, unholy rage that echoed off the walls, chilling everyone to the bone. This was not Roland. This was the entity, asserting its dominion. The malevolent spirit was not content with physical torment. It engaged in a deeply insidious psychological warfare. As Father William Bowdern and Father Raymond Bishop continued their prayers, the entity, speaking through Roland Doe's contorted form, began to whisper insidious secrets, revealing intimate, forgotten sins and private thoughts of the priests. It taunted them with details only they could know, twisting their past mistakes into weapons designed to shatter their faith and break their resolve. It probed their weaknesses, mocked their devotion, and attempted to sow seeds of doubt and fear, hoping to lure them away from their sacred duty. The air crackled with a palpable evil, its intent clear, to demoralize and defeat the men who dared to challenge its hold. The physical manifestations escalated alarmingly. Roland Doe, despite his young age and slight build, exhibited terrifying supernatural strength. When restrained, his body thrashed with incredible force, snapping leather straps and straining the grips of several men. During one particularly violent episode, he broke free, injuring both Father William Bowdern and Father Raymond Bishop, who struggled to hold him down while continuing the prayers. The room itself became a battleground, its temperature dropping dramatically to freezing levels despite the oppressive summer heat outside. Breath plumed visibly in the frigid air, and shivers ran down the spines of everyone present, a testament to the chilling power now fully unleashed within their midst. Objects flew across the room as if flung by an invisible hand, and the heavy bed on which Roland Doe lay bucked and groaned under the strain. Then came the horrifying revelation, a grim message scrawled across Roland Doe's flesh. As the priests intensified their prayers, a new set of angry red welts erupted across the boy's chest. These were not random scratches. They meticulously formed the word hell in vivid, bloody letters as if branded onto his very skin. It was a terrifying pronouncement, a clear signal from the entity that its possession had reached a terminal stage, that it intended to drag the boy's soul down into the abyss with it. The sight sickened the priests, but it also solidified their resolve. This was no mere illness, no psychological distress, but a battle for an eternal soul. The relentless nightly battles took a brutal toll on the priests, especially Father William Bodern, who led the charge against the demonic force. His health began to fail under the immense physical and spiritual strain. Sleep became a luxury he could rarely afford, and exhaustion etched deep lines of fatigue onto his face. Yet, despite his deteriorating condition, he refused to abandon Roland Doe. His commitment was unshakable, a testament to his profound faith and his unwavering determination to save the boy. He understood that Roland Doe was not merely a patient, but a soul in mortal peril, and he would fight until his last breath. During a brief, unsettling lull in the spiritual storm as the room quieted after a particularly violent outburst, the entity spoke again. The voice that emerged from Roland Doe's mouth was not the guttural roar they had grown accustomed to. It was cold, clear, and laced with an ancient, malevolent triumph, a voice that was distinctly not the boy's own. It declared with chilling certainty that it would never leave. It would remain bound to Roland Doe, it asserted, until it had claimed the boy's soul entirely, dragging it into the darkness from which it had come. The chilling pronouncement hung in the air, a terrifying promise that the true fight for Roland Doe's life was far from over. The final desperate stand against the malevolent entity took place within the quiet, seemingly sterile walls of the Alexian Brothers Hospital in St. Louis. Roland Doe had been moved to a secluded psychiatric wing, an environment designed for control and observation, yet one that now pulsed with an undeniable, heavy dread. The clinical white walls and hushed corridors offered little comfort against the unseen evil that still clung to the boy, making every shadow seem to writhe, every distant sound a potential precursor to terror. This was the arena for the ultimate confrontation, a place where science and faith would collide in a battle for a young soul. The ritual continued, night after agonizing night, reaching its terrifying crescendo on what would become known as the most violent night of the entire ordeal. Roland Doe, his frail body possessed by a horrifying strength, thrashed against his restraints, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. Then, as the priests intensified their prayers, a chilling phenomenon occurred. Roland Doe's body began to levitate several inches above the bed, defying gravity with an eerie stillness. From his throat, a cacophony of sounds erupted, not human cries, but the guttural growls of wild animals, the hiss of a serpent, and the mocking laughter that seemed to echo from the deepest pits of an ancient abyss. The entity through Roland was not merely resisting, it was openly mocking the sacred rites, challenging the very power of the divine invoked against it. Father William Bodern, his face etched with exhaustion but his spirit unyielding, knew this was the moment. He leaned closer to the possessed boy, his voice firm, echoing with an authority that transcended his weary frame. He demanded to know the entity's name, knowing that to name it was to claim a measure of power over it. The response was immediate and terrifying. Roland Doe's mouth contorted, and a chorus of voices, overlapping and distorted, screamed out, claiming to be legions, to be ancient, to be one of the fallen angels. The air grew impossibly heavy, charged with malice, and a palpable sense of otherworldly power, pressing down on everyone present, threatening to crush their will. It was at this critical, harrowing juncture that Father William Bodern, with Father Raymond Bishop supporting him, invoked the Archangel Michael, the heavenly warrior who cast Lucifer from paradise. As the names of the Archangel were pronounced with unwavering faith, a sudden, almost imperceptible shift occurred. Roland Doe, moments before a vessel of pure malevolence, suddenly let out a piercing, raw shout. It was not the entity's voice, nor was it Roland's typical frightened plea. The single word, "spite," ripped through the tense atmosphere, echoing off the walls with an unnerving resonance. It was a command, a final desperate outburst from the entity, as if ordered to leave against its will. Then, an event so sudden and profound it seared itself into the memories of all who witnessed it. A deafening crack, like an explosion or a thunderclap directly overhead, ripped through the room. It was not just a sound, it felt like a physical shockwave, vibrating through the very bones of the priests and attendants. Immediately following this cataclysmic sound, an absolute, profound silence descended. It was not merely the absence of noise, it was an oppressive, heavy stillness that swallowed all sound, all movement, all breath. It lasted for what felt like an eternity, a full 3 minutes, stretching the nerves of everyone present to their breaking point, before the normal sounds of the hospital slowly began to seep back in, timidly, as if unsure whether they were truly allowed. When the oppressive silence finally lifted, Roland Doe stirred. His eyes, no longer burning with an unholy light, blinked slowly, confused. He looked around the room, his gaze landing on Father William Bodern, then Father Raymond Bishop, then the other silent figures. His voice, small and uncertain, was undeniably his own. "Where am I?" he asked, his brow furrowed with genuine bewilderment. He remembered nothing of the past several months. nothing of the terrifying ordeal that had gripped him and terrorized his family and these brave men of God. The entity was gone. In the aftermath, Roland Doe went on to live a completely normal, anonymous life. He grew up, found work, married, and had children, forever shielded from the public eye. The trauma of those months was wiped from his conscious memory, allowing him to forge a new path untainted by the darkness he had endured. The priests, however, were changed forever. Father William Bowdern, though physically frail, emerged with an even deeper, unshakable faith, his soul bearing the scars of a battle few could comprehend. He had faced the abyss and returned, victorious, but profoundly transformed. The case of Roland Doe, an ordinary boy caught in an extraordinary struggle, became one of the most documented and controversial accounts of alleged demonic possession in history. Its chilling details eventually inspired the groundbreaking novel and iconic film, The Exorcist, forever cementing its place in popular culture and theology. Yet, even decades later, the profound question lingers. Was it a battle of the mind? A manifestation of severe psychological disturbance that science simply could not explain in the 1940s? Or was it, as the priests fervently believed, a true battle for a soul, a harrowing confrontation with an ancient, malevolent evil that chose a 13-year-old boy as its battleground? The answer, perhaps, remains in the depths of our own understanding, a testament to the enduring mysteries that lie beyond the veil of our perceived reality.